Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Today, we are going to be running through how to write a business continuity plan. My name is James Watts, and to kick off, I'm going to start with a little bit of housekeeping. So we are scheduled today to be running for 30 minutes. Now, hopefully that will include some time for Q&A. You should be able to see on the right side of your screen, there is a section you can type in any questions. It is just myself here today, so I probably won't be able to answer as I go. What I'll try to do is, if we have some time at the end, I'll run through any of those questions and answer as best I can. If there is anything that I'm not able to answer at the time, or if we run short on time, one of the downsides of trying to keep these webinars nice and short is that sometimes we do run long. I will make sure that we get back to everyone. I promise we always do respond to everyone individually. And if you have any questions that are we think might be useful for the rest of the group, what we'll do is we'll post those on our blog, and we'll make that available with the rest of the resources, which is to say this section in the middle there. Slides will be made available after this session. We are also recording the session today, so if there's anything that you need to refer to later on, you certainly can do. We'll pull all this together later on today, and we will send it out along with some of the resources that we're going to be talking about during the session. And in fact, the first thing that I want to mention is a quick plug to a follow-up webinar that we're going to be holding at the end of this month. So as part of building a business continuity plan, there are lots of models and tools that are very useful in helping you build these out. And one of the things that we've been very hot on in the last few years at Data Barracks is to try to build as many free tools that we can distribute that will assist in providing some help on each of those individual sections. Now, I'll make a note of when we're talking about one of those tools today, but we're not really going to have a chance to go through them in detail. So we thought what would be good is we'll have a second webinar. We'll do this at the end of the month, and we'll really go through in detail how you use each of those tools and how you can get some benefit from them, but also how you can kind of put them all together to help you build out your business continuity plan. The link to register is there. It's dvdr.io/toolshed. Because we originally started building a toolbox full of tools, and it grew so large, we're now calling it Toolshed. But we shall send out the link for that following this webinar, so you'll have that if you would like to sign up. So to kick off, I'm going to start with a couple of frequently asked questions, or perhaps even sort of common misconceptions about business continuity planning. Certainly, these are the questions that I think we hear most frequently, and they are the reason that we wanted to put this webinar on. And so the first question is, what should a business continuity plan look like? Now, we deal with a lot of folks in the IT space who are often being pushed a business continuity project, and very often it will be the first time that you've come to business continuity, and I think the first feeling is, right, I don't know where to start. Where do I go about this? But secondly, it's what is a good business continuity plan? What does a good version of a business continuity plan look like? Should I be aiming to reach a really short, very actionable document that is a handful of pages, or something very small that tells you specifically what you need to be doing in a disaster? Or should I be looking for something really, really comprehensive and a really big, long, detailed tome? And I think unfortunately, as is often the case with questions around business continuity, the answer is very much that it depends. In some cases, you may get away with something very, very small if you're a smaller business. In some cases, you need something larger. And I personally always hate when the answer to any question is it depends. So I'll try to give an example of this. Now, we host the Business Continuity podcast at Data Barracks. If you're interested in that, we will include that in the links. But it's you look it up on iTunes or go to the website, which is the bcpcast.com. And one of the consultants said something really interesting in the interviews, and he said, in talking about some continuity standards, he had a friend's company, really small business based up in the Lake District, a 10-person business, the printing business, and they suffered some issues around a flood. And he said they were a textbook example of how you can do business continuity really, really well. They had systems hosted elsewhere. They were able to work remotely. They were able to source alternate suppliers and alternate facilities to continue production. But if you were to ask them about business continuity, they wouldn't know what that was, or certainly wouldn't pass any kind of ISO standard for continuity. On the flip side of that, we've got some folks that we spoke to from the likes of BP, so enormous organizations, not just thousands of staff, we're talking thousands of locations, and the method for maintaining continuity and having a plan to keep that in place is obviously far more detailed. You don't have the organizational knowledge that can be contained for just looking after 10 members of staff and a small number of suppliers. So aside from the fact that we would always say a plan should always be as concise and succinct as possible, it very much is the case that it depends, which sort of leads to the following question, which is, where do I get started with this? So I think probably a lot of people will know a lot of the terminology around business continuity. I've heard of things like a business impact analysis, or a risk assessment and a risk register, but won't really know where to get into it. And very often what we'll see is that someone will jump sort of right in at a relatively late stage in this process, and they will start writing their business continuity plan, or in this case, it's an example document, one of the tools that you can download from our site, which is a template IT disaster recovery runbook. And very often the problem that you have here is that you're jumping straight into the plan without having done any of the legwork. So this is a bit of an admission here in that the name "How to Write a Business Continuity Plan" probably isn't entirely accurate. What we're going to be talking about today is a little larger than that. It's not just about the plan. What we're talking about is a business continuity management system. It's how you put all those things together. So the good news in the answer to where do you start is you don't need to make all of this up from scratch, although obviously it needs to be specific to you. There is a very mature and well-defined process of how you can go about doing this. And so our first piece of advice for today would be to go and take a look at this document. So this is, if anyone's been in business continuity for some time, they'll certainly know it. It's the BCI, or the Business Continuity Institute's Good Practice Guidelines. And it's so from the folks that we spoke to in the Business Continuity podcast, they were incredibly effusive about this document. It's not a dry, stale document that isn't useful. It's actually very, very actionable and very helpful. If you are a member of the BCI Institute, you will get access to it for free. But if not, you can purchase it for £30. We'll include the link in the resources at the end of the session today. And it really gives you an outline of exactly what you need to go about doing. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. And so I'll run you through exactly how we recommend doing this. So here's our kind of quick snapshot of the things that we'll be talking about. And you will notice this is all sort of top to bottom in a very distinct order. Now that isn't always the case. And certainly as we'll show, this isn't a start to finish project. It isn't something that you do once and leave. It is an ongoing cycle of maintaining and keeping up to date. But certainly for folks coming to this completely new, there is a good process that you can follow that will get you from A to B. So the first thing you need to do is set your policy, and that needs to happen at a very senior level, and it's the most important part. You need to, if you don't get this part right, obviously everything that follows thereafter is going to be compromised. So really important that you set out your management business continuity statement. What is it that you're trying to achieve? Which of your services are in scope? What isn't in scope? What is it that you want to achieve from your continuity program? Secondly, and I think again this follows on as being incredibly important, you then need to select your teams and determine the responsibility. I guess another issue that we'll often see, the reason that business continuity management tends to fail is that it is under-resourced. There aren't the people who have the time assigned to be able to go away and actually work through these processes. So getting that team in place and making sure they have the resource able to take it on. Once you've got your team and you know what you're trying to achieve, then there's the grunt work. And so sections 3 to 4 here are about the analysis that you will do and some of the tools that you'll be using. So going through and performing a risk assessment, cataloging your services, and doing dependency mapping of how those services map to resources and assets. And so all of those sections, that's the planning. This is you looking internally and seeing what is it that we need to achieve, how do we do that? All of this has gone on, and you'll see in terms of the amount of work that would take place, it's probably mean, while not perfect, it's not a bad indication that that is half of the work that needs to take place. Now we get onto the section that most people jump ahead to. So implementing your mitigation strategy. So this is once you've decided how you need to get back up and running, are you able to do that? That could be a disaster recovery contract. It could be an alternate premises. It could be alternate suppliers, etc. And then agreeing your activation plan. So actually writing the plans of how you go about doing this. So that's your enacting. And then finally, you have testing and exercising, and then how you maintain this, how you make it part of the business that you go about doing. So let's jump in. Policy. So setting up your policy. Now, if anyone happened to be on a webinar that we held probably a little while ago, I think last year, where we talked about an IT disaster recovery plan, I think I referenced my dislike for this particular model, but since then, I think in speaking with a number of people, it's the model that I think helps people to understand how all of this works visually. So we have right at the top your strategic priorities. So this, as I said, is why it's vital to get that policy set up correctly at the front end, because from there we have our management processes and our operational activities that lead on thereafter. And I think as a good model, it helps us to understand what goes on. So we have status that will be escalated in the event of a disaster, and then command and control that is pushed downwards in terms of how we action these things in a disaster itself. But I think the thing that really helps people in understanding and looking at this model is the relationship between IT disaster recovery and business continuity planning. Very often, we might speak with the business and say, do you have a business continuity plan in place? And I'll say, yep, definitely we have that. And in actual fact, what's there is what we would call a run book. So descriptions of how to bring servers up, what order they must come up in, something really technical, which often, I mean, will work perfectly, but potentially what you have in that situation is a business that can be up and running with all of their servers up and flashing, but no way for the business to actually carry on, which is why it's so vital to carry out all of these activities that are in the earlier stages. So you've set your policy, you've decided what is going to be in scope. Who then do you need to be involved? So we've got a quick model here of the different stages that take place during your business continuity planning. And who's involved. So as we said, it's vital that there is very, very senior management level buy-in in making business continuity a priority. They are the people who are responsible for setting that scope. But then they're also vital to make sure that continuity is embedded in the culture, to make sure that it runs throughout everything that you do. They will work with, we've got here CMT. So CMT in this case is crisis management team, or your business continuity team. Now, the number of people who would be involved in that will vary depending on the size of your organization. That could be just one person. In smaller organizations, we certainly have seen it being taken on by IT folks who can do a good job. And I think we certainly recommend that IT as a function is one of those areas in the business that if you are a small business and you don't have separate risk and continuity people, they're the best people who get that all-encompassing view of a business and know what the vital services are and how to deliver those. But that could be, say, in a larger organization, that could be including risk. It could be including continuity personnel. And so in terms of the order of how this all works, so that strategy is set by your continuity or your risk sponsor, and that's done in collaboration with the crisis management team. But once that's set up, then the bulk of the planning work goes on in the business impact analysis, the BIA consultation, and that will be your continuity team going out and working with departmental heads to identify the important business functions, assign recovery objectives and criticality. This is all of the planning, and then finally it's the management. So it's putting all of this in place, and that predominantly will happen in collaboration with department heads, but being led by the continuity team. And then there's the final part, which is to make sure that the wider business, all of the staff, are aware of what those processes are, if there is a disaster, what they would need to be doing, and then of course they're vital to be involved in all of the testing and exercising. So this is probably the most important part, I think, of what we're talking about today. The big bulk of good business continuity planning will happen here in the business impact analysis. So this is this is doing all of the grunt work for you. This is the most important part of your planning. Now, again, depending on the size of the organization, you may not need to use all of the analysis and tools that we have in the top right-hand corner here, but ultimately you will have the same objectives and the output that you want from your business impact analysis is the same. And so the quote that we have from the BCI Good Practice Guidelines in the middle is, it is the process of analyzing activities that affect that a business disruption might have on them. So your objectives are to identify the types of impact that an incident might have, to identify the most important business functions and the services that then support those functions, to then assign criticality to each of those services, to work out upstream and downstream dependencies that affect your ability to deliver. That could be power, that could be suppliers, that could be issues to the roads, etc. And then to work out and set out your recovery objectives with your justification. Now, as I say, a small business would probably be able to look at that and work all of those things out relatively simply. A larger business, it becomes more difficult, and then it becomes more important to apply some analysis and tools. And so we've got a list of different tools that you might use here. You might set out initially with working out a rating of your maturity of your resilience function. You would almost certainly be using a risk register and perhaps a matrix. You'll want to include some cost of downtime calculations and a figure for what is your maximum tolerable period of disruption, which is the maximum length of time that you would still be able to survive an incident. And you'll want to map some of those dependencies back. Now, the other reason I've named each of those tools is those are all tools that we can provide. We have free tools that you can either use online or download and work through. But I say we shall pop the links to that, and then we'll go through those in detail in the webinar at the end of the month. But the ultimate output is, once you've done all of this big work in your business impact analysis, it has spat out at the end of it all of the recommendations that you will then need to implement, and then to write up your business continuity plan, your IT disaster recovery plan, your crisis communications plan, your crisis management plan, etc. All of the work will be done here, and it will make those following sections far easier for you to implement. So a really quick word here on budgeting for continuity, which I think is probably one of the other sort of most frequent questions that we would hear. And obviously we've talked about that being a management level objective to set that budget, but it is a fluid factor. There are some factors that you need to weigh in, and I think this is what we're trying to show here on this graph. So the red line is the cost of business disruption. So as we know, at the bottom left-hand side, you can have a disruption which, certainly I'm of the opinion that there are a lot of businesses who you can have an hour or two of downtime, and actually the impact may be negligible in terms of a real cost. But as that grows and that becomes longer and longer, that curve's going to steepen and your costs are going to ramp up. On the flip side, we've got the black line, so that is the cost of your continuity solution. So on the far right-hand side at the bottom, that is the cost of putting nothing in place. It will take you a very long time to recover from an incident. Whereas on the left-hand side at the top, that steepens sharply to get around the tongue twister. And I think probably to give an example here, if we were to talk about an IT disaster recovery example, we might mark on this graph recovery with a tape backup solution. Now that's going to be a relatively low cost, but a relatively long time to recover, versus multi-site high availability, which will be a high cost, but will have very little downtime. And so and just to be clear, this doesn't apply just to IT. We can apply it to premises. The cost of having a second site to be able to recover to, or perhaps some other relationships with suppliers. But what we need to do is we need to set out where do we want to be on this. Now, to take this example a little further, if we were to look at IT disaster recovery, this won't be the case for certain other aspects, but we can say, right, well, we know this can then feed into our decision making. We need a solution that will give us a recovery time objective of X, and a recovery point objective of Y, and that then will that'll dictate what our work recovery time is and what our maximum tolerable downtime is. There's a lot on here. We probably won't get through all of this in this session, but you can kind of refer back to in the slides. But what you can do is you can work this out, and then you can map this against your graph of where you want to be, and you can say, right, well, actually, if we want to be here, it's going to cost us X amount. If we want to be here, it's going to cost us a different amount, and work through this and get to a figure that you're comfortable with, that ticks your boxes in terms of recovery, but at the same time, it ticks the boxes in terms of the budget for continuity. Now, a quick word on this as another section that is really important, but I think is probably under-recognised and underutilised, and that is to look at the mapping of your important functions through to your services. So here again, we've got an IT example. I tried to make as many examples IT centric as possible for today, having a look through the folks that we had who were registered to attend. It seemed we did have a big bulk of IT folks on. So one of the things I think probably, one of the things in IT we're very good at is we can say we know how long it will take us to recover this server. We say what's our process for recovering? And we'll say, right, well, this bit of hardware I can get back in X number of hours. But obviously that's a very technology-centric view of this. What we should be focusing on is what's the service that we're actually delivering here. So this is one of the tools again that you can work through, and we use it to map the IT and the assets that power those services through to the service that you're delivering. And then what we can do is get an idea for the recovery times for email as a service rather than an email server or a hosted email service and any other dependencies that it might have. We can extend this beyond IT. You could look at this as a manufacturer and say, I manufacture widget A. And for me to be able to do that, what I need is 3 different supplies from 3 different suppliers. I need a production process, and then I need a X number of resources internally for us to deliver that. How quickly do I need to bring that back, and what is my process for doing so if I were to lose any of those things? So this is a whistle-stop tour, and I will say, just to add here, obviously this is an enormous subject to try and get through in 30 minutes, so we're covering things at a bit of a rate of knots. But this first section we've talked about, that was your internal planning. That was all of the work that you need to do to get yourself set up. And so by this point, what you will have is a good structure in place. You'll have the right people doing this, and then you will have a business impact analysis that tells you what you need to go out and implement. And then the next stage is to implement. So a handful of things here to talk about. So we're not just talking about IT, we are talking about people, about premises, about suppliers. So the most obvious example here might be your business impact analysis will tell you, right, we need to bring our systems back in a shorter length of time than we're able to do so at the moment. So we need to go and source a new solution that will allow us to do that. It could be we have we wouldn't have anywhere for our people to work from in the event of a disaster, so we need to find some work area recovery. Not all of these mitigation strategies need to be projects that you go out and commission. They don't necessarily need to be something that costs money, but they need to be things that are then planned out. It could be planning out what this process is and making sure we can then educate the workforce and let them know what it is that they need to do. So this includes, the following thing, once you have then gone and implemented those strategies, is now you can write it all up. I think hopefully probably you can see from where we are in the length of time of the webinar, but we've gone through an awful lot at this point just to get to the point that I think most people dive into and start writing their continuity plans and their run books. This is a really easy process if you've been through all of those earlier steps. If not, and you're just coming to it cold, it can be difficult. And obviously, as I say, we can sometimes be either putting in strategies that don't meet the need, or we can be overdoing it and providing, over providing for what's required. And a really quick kind of note here on agreeing a communication plan, and that's a few things. So this could be communication externally, a media plan, a press plan of how you will communicate with them to let them know what is going on and how this is, how you're handling it, how you communicate with your customers, but then also how you communicate internally. I think we see a lot of examples of this. There's a really good one recently of Maersk, the global shipping and transportation company, who suffered an issue with the NotPetya ransomware. and their CEO came out and said the one thing that they've learned from this is how do you communicate internally. They ended up reverting to using WhatsApp for their internal communications. And now there are lots of companies who I know who are relatively small who will use WhatsApp as a method for them, but that's not something that you want to be working on or deciding at the time of the incident. Communication is absolutely vital. I think we often say you'd almost rather have a recovery that doesn't go so well, but that you can communicate well, than a really good recovery that is poorly communicated with everyone who's involved, because that can sabotage how well things will go. So there's a handful of methods you can use for this. You can use call trees, you can use internal contact cards. Ultimately, the things that you need to do is the staff need to know where they need to go. They need to know what their next action is. Is it to call into a telephone number to find out what the status is? And then finally, the point we've got here is you can use a mass notification service. Now, there's lots of really good mass notification tools that you can buy. Often we find, I think probably in our conversations with smaller businesses, is that they won't have anything in place. A lot of those tools are built for very large enterprises or for councils, etc. So one of the tools that we have is how you can build your own quickly and effectively for a really low cost. Again, we'll kind of ping out the link to that shortly. And then once it's all in place, you've written up that document, you have it. How do you then know all of this works? And there is only one way to find that out, and that is to exercise and test. Usually at this point in any session where we talk about testing and exercising, someone will pop in a question and say, be really clear about the semantics here. So a lot of folks don't like the term testing, because to test will imply that you can fail. So you don't test a business continuity plan, you exercise that plan. With that being said, there are things that you can specifically test that will fail. The best example here is the recovery of a server. Did it come up? Was it working? If not, that's a failure. And then important so you, from working through your business impact analysis, you have your objectives, you have recovery that you want to occur in X number of hours. Does that work? The first metric that's most important for any testing and exercising is did you do it? Because the big issue for a lot of people is finding the time to do this. So just being able to do that is a really good start. But then, have you met each of those objectives that you set out in your business impact analysis? And there's I think, as someone said in the business continuity podcast, it's only a failure if you don't fix any issues. No one expects any of the exercising to go without a hitch. This is how you find and you refine, and then you work back and improve any of that documentation. And so a kind of quick word here, we have because this issue is it's one of those areas where the issue is having the time to do this. There's a number of different kinds of tests that you can do. Obviously, you can have a full test. You can have a partial test that will have a certain amount of user acceptance testing. But we've built a tool that will help do tabletop testing. So it's a simulator that you can run through with a handful of different incidents, such as IT failure, power failure, and working through a cyber incident. They take 5, 7, and 10 minutes each. Really useful exercises, I think, for particularly larger teams to work through and share throughout a whole team, so that everyone gets an idea of what this process is, and then hopefully it will give you ideas for your own tabletop testing that you can do internally. And so the final slide then of all of these sections is what I was referring to at the start. I started with a long list of the things that we would talk about today in a table, sort of top to bottom, but that's not really what a business continuity management system should look like. This is from the Business Continuity Institute's Good Practice Guidelines, and it's a circle. And it's a circle because it doesn't stop. It goes on and on. So there's design that feeds into implementation, and then validation, and then comes back to analysis and design, and goes round and round. The really important part, I think, of making sure this works properly. One of the biggest causes of I think businesses to think that continuity programs don't offer them value is that they're looked at as point-in-time exercises. You do it as a project, which works, it's great, you get all of your documentation up to speed, but then it's left, it's not updated, and obviously over time, as things change, that becomes less and less valuable, and you find that you then are in a really bad shape and you need to come back to this. The way that you get around that is by making sure that you are feeding all of these things back in, you're staying on top of it, documentation's happening, testing is occurring, and ultimately you're staying resilient, not just becoming resilient for one time every 3 to 5 years. And that is us for time today. So I apologise. I did say I would try to get through and have some time for questions, but I am always really keen that we stick to the schedule. I see that we do have some questions, so I will get back to everyone individually for that. Here are the list of the resources that we talked about. So if you don't feel you need to scribble these down right now, we will send these out to you afterwards, along with the slides and a link to the recording. And so I'd like to say thank you very much for joining us. I hope you'll join us again at the end of the month for the next webinar, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much.